What's up? What's up? Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to Reform Perspective. It is a joy to be here with you this evening. I'm pretty excited about today. I got a really special guest, and we're going to be tackling the topic of apologetics. He's a friend of mine. He's a pastor here in Hesperia, California. He's actually my sending pastor for our church plant in the high desert of California as well. He is the author of We Destroy Arguments, How Presuppositional Apologetics Empowers the Believer to Refute Unbelief. If that doesn't sound reformed to you, I don't know what else does. Please welcome everybody, my friend and my pastor, Pastor Stephen Feinstein.
Hey, everybody. Josiah, thanks for having me on your podcast today. I look forward to being able to talk about presuppositional apologetics.
Awesome, man. Well, it's good to have you on here. We might as well just jump into it, man. I have a couple questions. I will talk a little bit about the book. I did order it on Kindle, so I don't have the awesome cover to show everybody, but maybe you do. There you go. There it is. Thank you. See, I should be much more prepared. We Destroy Arguments. Yes. All right. Cool. Well, let's get into the first question. The first question I got is, what is apologetics?
Okay. So apologetics, a lot of you guys will know, just means the defense of the faith. It comes from the Greek word apologia, which just means defense. It's not apologizing for the faith. It's making a defense. It's almost the same type of defense a lawyer would make for a client. When we are called to make a defense for the faith and for the hope that is within us, according to 1 Peter chapter 3, that's the task of apologetics. And so one way I like to think about it is think of evangelism as a coin. Heads would be evangelism, tails would be apologetics. Because when you're out there proclaiming the truth, proclaiming the gospel, there will be times where it's challenged. And apologetics then is the other side of that coin, where you refute the objections and you show how and why Christianity is the true faith, which then ends up strengthening your evangelism.
Awesome. I think that's the perfect definition of what that is. As I was reading your book, I noticed that you did, I think in your first chapter, after the introductory chapter, you talked about five different types of apologetics. I think there's the classic apologetics approach. I think William Lane Craig is very, very well known in Christian circles for this approach. Was this started by like Anselm, I think, or maybe he was the father, I think, of classic apologetics?
I wouldn't say that. I know that Aquinas is, I guess you could say, the foremost proponent of the cosmological argument. But then even that was built off of Aristotle. So classical apologetics even predates Christianity itself. It's just Christianity co-opted some of the arguments. And so the cosmological argument, I would say, was perfected by Aquinas. And then Anselm is the one who gives us the ontological argument. So usually what happens within the realm of classical apologetics, you have the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, which usually I would say is closer to the Enlightenment era, and then you have the ontological argument that goes back to that goes back to Anselm. And so all those guys are related to it, but to say that Anselm started it, I'm not entirely sure on that.
All right. No, I was just wondering. I'm going to get schooled today. There's a next one, evidentialism. I think this one's actually pretty popular. I think Christians unknowingly do this one naturally without really thinking about the evidentialist perspective. I think they just kind of do it just because I think they're trained to do it in most Christian circles. Do you know, or can you give a small definition of the evidentialist?
Yeah, evidentialism is the attempt to prove Christianity true by an inductive case built on evidence. And so the most classic version of this would be, I would say, Gary Habermas's argument for the resurrection of Christ. You know, he starts with 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and then just goes through all the historical evidence and historical arguments that you could find there. I'd say Lee Strobel does the same thing in his book Case for Christ. And what you do is you start from the bottom up and you build this case based on evidence to lead one to the, I guess you could say, the greater probability that Christianity is true based on that evidence. And so the Enlightenment, so the Enlightenment for the most part repudiated classical apologetics. And so evidential apologetics, I think, was the answer to that. So how, using the Enlightenment man's presuppositions, how can we, refute them on their own presuppositions or own assumptions? And so that's what evidentialism's all about.
Got it. Okay. Another one was the cumulative case. I'm not familiar. This is the first time I've ever heard of the cumulative case. What is the cumulative case method?
So cumulative case apologetics is the idea that you're going to kind of mix and match a number of different tests. So if you just make a historical argument, that's great. But on its own, it might not be persuasive. And so what about a scientific argument? What about a psychological argument? What about a philosophical argument? So it actually tries to combine the best of these, but it's still evidential when it comes down to it. And so their analogy, the proponents of it, would be like every form or every apologetic argument is a bucket that has a leaky hole in it. But if you take 10 different buckets with a hole in it and you stack them together, they kind of cover each other's hole, and you end up with a more foolproof apologetic.
Got it. Okay. Another one that I've never heard of was Reformed epistemology. Pretty fancy words. Epistemology, isn't that the study of how things come to be or come to exist, or what is epistemology?
So epistemology is, by definition, is the study of knowledge. Okay. Specifically, it asks and answers the question of how do we know what we know? On what basis do we know it? And so Reformed epistemology as an apologetic really is just a negative apologetic. And what I mean by that is apologetics have a negative and positive component usually. The negative component shoots down the other position. The positive component builds up our position. Reformed epistemology really doesn't try to make an argument for Christianity. It simply tries to justify Christianity by showing that everybody has faith. So the most hardcore atheist will come to you and say, hey, you guys base what you believe on faith. We don't. We base it on facts. But then you could ask a series of questions to prove to them that that's not true. For example, I could ask an atheist, how do you know Paraguay is real? If you have not been there, then they'd say, well, because I've seen it in a geography book. And so then I could come back and say, okay, so you're trusting a book written by men, and you just happen to deem that book to be authoritative. So you trust that there really is a Paraguay, but you haven't verified it yourself. And so on the same token that they try to knock us for having a blind faith and trusting authority, actually, everybody does this. And so we are built to trust things on authority, and all humans do it. Yeah. So all Reformed epistemology does is point that out. But then they don't really go from there. And so it's not satisfactory because of that.
So the earth is flat. No, I'm just kidding. Because how can we know? No, yeah, good. It's cool. So the last one, the presuppositionalist. That is a big word that took me a long time to even learn how to say it correctly. I think I was explaining this to you before we started the video. I got introduced to this by a friend of mine who took me to a small gathering with a few believers down in Marietta, and he introduced me to a man named Seitan Bruggencate, and he was talking about his apologetics in this group. And so that's how I got introduced to presuppositionalism. And I don't know if this is normal, but I don't think I've never ever met anyone who wasn't reformed who was a presup. I think that's pretty common. And then that kind of led me down with a rabbit hole with Jeff Durbin. And then I don't think Douglas Wilson is presup, but I know James White is. And I saw Dr. James White, I think, is a presup as well, and I saw a debate with him and David Silverman, where he did a pretty good job using presuppositionalism, and so that really led me down a whole mess of stuff, and that's how I got introduced to Reformed theology too. But anyways, all that to say is, what is presuppositionalism?
Well, your observation is 100% spot on. I cannot imagine there being an Arminian presuppositionalist. In fact, Cornelius Van Til, the father of presuppositional apologetics, defined it as the Reformed apologetic. He said there's a distinct Reformed way of defending the faith, and he believed that he traced this mode of thinking to Calvin. If we're going to be honest, I would say that's a little bit anachronistic. Calvin was not a presuppositionalist, but based on Calvinist presuppositions, our assumptions, our axioms, what we believe about the Bible, this definitely is the way that makes most sense to defend the faith. So what presuppositionalism is it more or less starts with the fact that nobody's neutral, right? You're either under the headship of Adam or you're under the headship of Christ. And those who are under the headship of Adam are unregenerate. Mm-hmm. They only have the fallen nature, and the fallen nature has to deal with what are called the noetic effects of sin. The noetic effects of sin more or less state that total depravity affects every part of us. So it's not that our minds and our logic is neutral, but our hearts and our morals are tainted by sin. That was the fundamental assumption of classical apologetics back in the Middle Ages, that the logic and reasoning of man is untouched by the fall. It's only our morals. That's not true. Right. The logic of man is just as affected by the fall as our morals. And so because of that, you can't really argue somebody into the kingdom when you are entering into their world and arguing from assumptions and beliefs that already presuppose God doesn't exist, right? So we start with the presupposition that God does exist, and we start really, before we get into evidence, we start at the level of presuppositions. What do you presuppose versus what do we presuppose? And let's test these presuppositions to see which one even makes sense out of the world.
I'm going to get more into that idea of the evangelistic method of apologetics and presuppositionalism, because I do have a question about that, and I think it'll be a good conversation. But before we get there, I want to ask, in terms of your book, in your introduction, you start with this analogy of David and the ark. A pretty provocative initial introduction to your book, but your basic premise in the book is that it's not sufficient to only have a passion and a desire to defend the Lord or to do what the Lord asks, because method matters. And what you get into is the analogy is that David is bringing the ark to Israel, to back to the nation of Israel, but that he didn't do it in the correct method. He was using pagan methods. So what is it about the method of presuppositionalism that outperforms other methods in your perspective?
No, that's a good question. So one of the mission statements of our church, Sovereign Way Christian Church, is that we want to be biblical people doing biblical things the biblical way, right? And a lot of times people think the biblical way isn't prescribed by the Bible, that it's really up for debate, it's up for grabs, right? So what presuppositionalism as an apologetic methodology says is that no, there is a biblical way to do apologetics. And so we can't just do whatever we want to do for the method, because you might find yourself dishonoring God. A case example would be evangelism, right? We know the Bible, in every command that relates to evangelism, we're commanded to go out, right? Evangelism is what we do out in the community. Okay, it's not something that we do inside the church. We're not supposed to tailor our entire church service to saving the lost. Church is for the edification of the saints, right? Now, we still preach the gospel every service, because what if that unbeliever shows up? 1 Corinthians 14 presupposes that. So I could look at a megachurch that, for the most part, makes their whole evangelism about getting people to invite unbelievers to church, right? Mm-hmm. They're doing the biblical thing, which is evangelism, but they're not doing it the biblical way. And so you end up with the consequence. The consequence ends up being a very shallow membership that doesn't know anything about the Bible, because they're not taught, because it's the same evangelistic milk week in, week out, right? So on the same token, if you're going to defend the faith, you want to defend the faith in a way that comports with the Bible. So when you look at 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, which is the classical text for apologetics, the first thing it tells you before it tells you to make a defense for anybody who asks a hope, it tells you to sanctify Christ in your heart as holy, to set Christ apart as holy. And so you're setting Christ apart as Lord, as holy. And so you have to ask yourself, does it treat Christ as holy for me to go to the unbeliever and say, let's assume that God doesn't exist, or let's assume that we don't know if God exists, and you're the jury, and I'm going to present a case, and then you get to vote on the end as to whether or not you think God exists. That really doesn't do much honor to God, if you think about it. And that's kind of how God's Not Dead, the first one, starts off, where the classroom ends up being the jury, as if their vote determines whether or not God exists. Bottom line is, we're to call people to repentance. And so the first thing we're supposed to proclaim to them is the absolute lordship and existence of God. To use a classical apologetic methodology to say, I'm going to offer a probability to you that God exists. And as long as P is greater than 5.1, I win. That's not honoring God, because all I've done is make a case with human logic that there's a 51% probability that God exists. But then that means I'm saying there's a 49% probability that he doesn't. That's nonsense.
Right.
And so if I'm going to set Christ apart as holy, as Lord, and it's from that standpoint that I make the defense, then there's never any point in that where I'm ceding any ground to the unbeliever's assumption or even belief that God doesn't exist.
So what you're getting at is ultimately laying the foundation for your presupposition, and I think that's the hardest part for most Christians, is they want to be able to debate in the evidentialist sphere. They want to be able to use evidence in history. But presuppositionalist begins with the presupposition that God is Lord.
Yeah. Van Til has a famous statement where he said, rather than arguing endlessly back and forth about facts, we first have to talk about the philosophy of fact. And I thought that was a light bulb moment for me. Because like you said, I was an evidentialist like everybody else. In fact, my undergraduate work was in history, and that's all about, evidential reasoning. But eventually I had to come to terms with what the scripture says. And, in response to what you just said, the reason why I think Christians naturally assume evidentialism is because we have been regenerated. We've been given that new mind, that new heart. We're being conformed to the image of Christ. And so in our heart of hearts, we do know that all real evidence does build a case that points straight to Christ. It's impossible for it not to, right? And so I think we take for granted the miraculous work of salvation that God does in us. And so then we assume the evidential reasoning that makes sense to us is going to make sense to the world. And what I'm saying is we should not assume that, because the scriptures tell us they are dark. They are suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. And so we have to start there.
Yeah, good. All right, another question I got. In your book, you ask pastors and apologists 4 questions. And I don't want to hit on all 4 because then we'll be here all night. But I'm gonna hit on the second one and then kind of segue into the 4th, because I thought the second one was one of the more provocative ones. You ask, does your method of defending the faith consist of you learning numerous secular facts and arguments, and then through secular means trying to prove the Bible is true? I think this is what you were hinting at just right now. So why is it a poor method of apologetics? I think you've already answered this, because I don't think what you're saying is that we shouldn't use historiography or archaeology or science or anything like that. But why is it a poor method of apologetics to just memorize historical facts or historical information and scientific facts to try to prove the Bible's historicity or God's existence, instead of beginning with the notion that from God all things are already in existence because of him, that truth is derivative of God? That why is that a poor method?
Yeah, fair question. So yeah, in answer to that, there's actually a couple angles that I'm going to answer from that. First off, remember that there is no neutrality, right? So the methods and beliefs of fallen humanity, according to Romans chapter 1, they suppress the truth and unrighteousness. Right, their hearts have been darkened. They exchange the truth for a lie, and they worship the creature instead of the creator. So all their so-called knowledge that they build, they're building it from the perspective of already rejecting God. Now, does that mean that there's no truth in what they say? No, absolutely not, because we know that common grace exists, and we also know that general revelation does bear out true things. And so they can determine facts, but the interesting thing is when they do, it's inconsistent with their own presuppositions. Now, in answer to the question of why Christians should not build their foundation on that is secular methodologies, which have been designed off the assumption that God doesn't exist, is never going to add up to showing that God does exist. And so what you're doing is you're walking into a fight where they're asking you to tie your hands behind your back and tie your feet together and blindfold yourself while they're able to go full on MMA on you.
Right.
So it doesn't make any sense to do it that way. Mm-hmm. Now, is there a place for history? Is there a place for science and a place for philosophy? Absolutely. And so in my book, I point out that there's a way that we engage in the presuppositional argumentation. And part of that requires us to show that the unbeliever is arbitrary. Okay, that they have without justification, they hold their beliefs without justification. And one way that you're going to do that is by making an evidential argument. One thing that frustrates me about popular presuppositionalists is a lot of times when I see them argue with people, they never get to the evidence. They just keep saying, well, what are your presuppositions for that evidence? What are your presuppositions for that evidence?
I think that was my hard part, or that's what I had a difficulty with, Sai.
Yeah, and they're not answering the objections, right? And so then the unbeliever walks away feeling justified. And what I'm saying is that is a poor practice of presuppositionalism. Once you make your case that they cannot hold to anything based on their presuppositions, even if they disagree, move on, show them their arbitrariness, show them that you do respect evidence, show them that you do respect logic, you're just putting it in its right place. Otherwise, for those who are watching, they're going to think you're just playing semantic games, and you don't want to do that.
Yeah, good. I think I have a quote here from your book, and I really like this. I think this kind of summarizes what it is that you're trying to say. I do not want my words to be misconstrued. However, I am not saying that secular learning has no place, but its place must be in submission to the scripture. And I think that really captures the essence of what presuppositionalism is that we're not saying that we can't use evidence or can't use history, can't use science. It's that it has to be in submission. You have to begin first and foremost with God and his holy word. And I think that's what you're trying to get at, because the unbeliever begins with his logic and his reasoning. That's his justification. That is his authority, is his logic or his reasoning. And we don't ask them not to use logic or reasoning. But they always ask us not to use scripture or to use God.
Yeah. Enter the fight with their presuppositions, but not with yours.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's the
And could I add something that I forgot in my last answer?
Yeah, whatever you want.
Why it's not prudent for us to build an entire case off their arguments. Again, this is a Reformed apologetic. And so what do Reformed folk believe? Well, we believe that apart from the regeneration of the Holy Spirit, and apart from Christ drawing, or apart from the Father drawing us to Christ, before that regeneration, that no one can come, right? So we're not going to be able to argue somebody into the kingdom. An Arminian soteriology assumes that, by somebody's own free will, without any aid from God, that they will be able to come to the faith. And so, of course, from that standpoint, it makes sense. Just stack up more evidence. Maybe what they're lacking is education. But what we understand is that no matter what we say, we cannot make a dead heart come back to life. Okay? So our apologetics has to be part of the evangelism. It has to be something that's building and supporting the gospel. And just giving people scientific facts or historical facts in and of itself doesn't actually proclaim the gospel, right? And so presuppositionalism is meant to undercut everything the unbeliever believes so that they have no choice but to come to terms with that gospel that we're proclaiming.
Now, you and I, we both drink deeply from the Reformed well. And so we are, I think we're well aware of the reality that if believers use evidentialism, Reformed epistemology, even the classical case, whatever, the classical apologetics, God can use any means to bring about his elect. But what you're trying to get at is consistency and is faithfulness ultimately to the Word of God. Because it seems like, and maybe you can clarify this, but it seems like when we start with other methods first, evidentialism or even classical philosophy, we're using secular means, or we're starting primarily with secular means, humanistic means, and then trying to work our way up to God, rather than beginning with God and working our way down to man.
Yeah. I'm not trying to change topics, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
By an example, okay, there's a lot of controversy over critical race theory and intersectionality right now. That these are these just secular analytical tools that could help us combat racism, or are these really invasive philosophies and ideologies that undercut the entire gospel and eventually would destroy within a church what the gospel produces? And I think that's a valid question, right? And what I have found interesting is that the very people who say, hey, critical race theory and intersectionality are secular ideologies, they have no place in the church. A lot of times these same people, though, with apologetics will use secular ideologies to try to affirm and build up and bolster the faith. You can't have it both ways. And so to me, I'm not saying, therefore, embrace critical race theory too. What I'm saying is, listen, be biblical in both. Okay, let the scripture be our guide. We don't have to rely or build our case or anything off these secular methodologies. Instead, we let God be true and everyone else a liar. And so we build it off the Bible. And of course, all these other methodologies will be in submission to what the Bible says. Again, common grace means they're going to get some things right. So we could use that.
Right.
But at the same time, we reject anything that contradicts what the scripture says.
Amen. All right, just to kind of wrap this up, because I know we could probably keep talking, but if from your book, this is the fourth question that you ask. This is the last question. You say, and it's paramount. Please, I beg you, think through the implications. If the Bible can be demonstrated as true only if you can prove it with history and science, then does that mean that the Bible is under their authority? And you've talked about this before, about how we don't want to put God in some kind of judgment seat where we're having people make judgments about God, about whether or not he exists, and use humanistic reasoning or intellect alone. We're trying to make an argument, or the apologists are trying to make arguments based upon the truth of God and allowing the Spirit to do a work so that in the truth of Scripture and in the truth of exposing God, that they would see the light. And when we start with humanistic reasoning, then you could only end up with a deist or a theist and not a born-again believer. Because this is the case, right? I mean, there are people that can be convinced of the evidentialist perspective or the classical perspective, and then they only believe that God exists. They don't bow the knee to his lordship. They don't worship him as God. They don't love him, and they don't surrender their lives to him. They don't live for the kingdom. They're just deist. What is it about presuppositional apologetics that really adheres to an evangelistic method?
Yeah, that's a great question, because to what pretty much the gospel you preach is the gospel you save people to. The God that you defend apologetically is the God that you bring them to. So am I bringing them to the God of the ancient Greek philosophers, or to the God of the Enlightenment philosophers, or am I bringing them to the God of the Bible, right? And if we take the Bible and say it can only be true if it passes humanity's own tests of veracity, then again, we've already placed humanity on an authority level above God. And I've heard Christians say that, you can't bring the Bible into the argument until you've already proven with human knowledge that the Bible is the Word of God. I'm like, you got that backward. You absolutely have that backward. The first question you ask is not prove that the Bible is the Word of God. You ask this question: if the God of the Bible is true and He gave us a word, what would it look like? Well, I think it would look like 66 books written by over 45 different authors, written over a span of 1,400 years on 3 different continents and 3 different languages, written by people from all walks of life, whether they're kings, shepherds, prophets, statesmen, you name it. And yet this anthology of these 66 books coheres and creates a meta-narrative of a single scripture or single storyline that sums up all of history and where it's going. In relation, or in comparison, you could take the Great Western Classics, which is 2,500 years worth of literature of the most brilliant philosophers and thinkers of all history, at least in the West, and you put those together in an anthology. There is no cohesive meta-narrative. In fact, one author disagrees with the other, and they're all disproving themselves. And so humanity by itself, when random people are writing random books and you put them together, it doesn't create a cohesive story. The scriptures, in contrast, do, because it's not only a work of humanity, it's a work of divinity. Yeah. It has all the marks. If God wrote an anthology for us, I would expect there to be "Thus says the Lord" 3,000 times. If the Lord wrote an anthology, I would expect there to be prophecy that is verifiably fulfilled in history. So my point is, if you look at that, I didn't make an evidential argument for why the Bible is the Word of God. Instead, I made a presuppositional statement that if God gave us a word, this is what it would look like. And then we ask, does the Bible look like that? It absolutely does. And so if it does, and since it does, why in the world would we then take humanity's track record and say, well, we're only going to bring the Bible in as authoritative if humanity verifies it? That makes no sense.
Yeah. Amen. Just to kind of give a final question, just your thoughts on this, because when I started really getting into the topic of apologetics, I always thought to myself, there's no way I could ever master the full massive library of subjects. It can be daunting, it can be scary for Christians, especially new Christians, born again believers, especially those who are just getting into the idea of apologetics. It can feel daunting. Just give like a word of encouragement for those believers who are getting into this topic. Why study apologetics? Why do we need apologists, professional apologists, or even why should the average Christian have a basic apologetic worldview that will help them to properly defend the faith?
There's a lot of levels to that question.
I'm sorry.
No, it's good. So first, I guess to obey the command that we always are supposed to be ready to defend the faith, to give the hope, to provide a defense for the hope that is within us, as 1 Peter 3:15 says. That's a command. And so do we love the Lord enough to obey that command? What does it take for us to always be ready? Okay, so that means we need to be looking into stuff. Now listen, you're finite, I'm finite. We can never master all of human knowledge, let alone all of the knowledge of the universe. So there's always going to be gaps in our knowledge, and that's okay. So on one hand, just do what you can to obey the command. Study this stuff. Second, when you do study this, it does encourage and build your faith. Right? So it doesn't only help you obey a command of the Lord, but at the same time, you're like, wow, my faith is very reasonable. And that does help you evangelize. You go out with more confidence because if somebody throws an objection at you, you feel like you know the answer to that objection. So it encourages you. And then at the same time, sometimes we have our wobbly-kneed, weaker brothers and sisters in Christ. And they need that apologetics. There was a guy at our church a few years ago who one neighbor was a Jehovah's Witness, another neighbor was an atheist, and then there was a Mormon, and I forgot who else, all around him, and he was constantly in a crossfire of all these false beliefs, and he was a new believer. That guy was at a very dangerous time when they were all going for his head when he could barely defend himself. Fortunately, he was at a church where we practice presuppositional apologetics, and he was able to be equipped to where he was able to deal with them. And so sometimes it's a means that we use to strengthen other sheep. And it's not just for pastors. It's for the whole flock, because we're all supposed to be evangelizing. So that's an important part of it. And then the final level to answer this, because there's going to be unbelievers that know more about certain things than I know or you know. So when you get to the second half of my book, and I'm actually using this methodology on specific unbelieving worldviews, atheism, macroevolution, dualism, and things like that. I use martial arts as the analogy. Okay, so in the first half of the book, I use building a shed because we're building a worldview. The second half, when we're using it, it's spiritual war, man. We're in combat. So what better analogy than martial arts? And so to break away from my analogy in my book, because in my book, since I love Bruce Lee, I use Jeet Kune Do as the paradigm, but I'm going to use Krav Maga right now as an example. That's an Israeli military self-defense, and it's designed to take a woman who is 5'4" and 100 pounds and make it to where she could defend herself against a 6'5", 250 pounder, right? Now, that bigger man has every advantage in the world. But the whole design of this system is, even though the lady has less knowledge, less things in her favor, is there a strategy that she could win and walk away alive? And that's the idea behind presuppositionalism. You don't have to know more than your opponent. You simply have to be able to prove how on their presuppositions, they can't justify the knowledge that they have, right? They can't justify the positions they have. They can't justify the existence of knowledge. They can't justify the uniformity of nature. They can't justify logic. They can't justify moral absolutes. They're woefully arbitrary and inconsistent. And so you don't have to know as much as they do. When you got the tools that are in this book and other presuppositional books, you would have everything you need to take down an opponent who knows more facts than you do, because you could render all their facts void. And that's the point with this.
Awesome. I think that is a good way to wrap this up. Thank you so much, Pastor Stephen Feinstein of We Destroy Arguments. I really do encourage everyone to buy this book. I'm already a couple chapters in, and I'm already learning and gleaning from so much of it, and just reigniting some of my theological training that's easily forgotten. You get into the concept of epistemology, defeating atheism, macroevolution, the problem of evil, secular dualism and idealism, transcendental mysticism and immanent moralism, all of these huge, fancy, awesome apologetic words that I think the average Christian could still pick up and read. It is an awesome read so far. And Pastor Stephen, I appreciate you coming on. I hope you have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I really appreciate you, man.
You as well, brother. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and thanks for having me on. This was fun.
Absolutely, man. We'll have to do this more often in the future, too.
Absolutely.
All right. Appreciate you.
All right. God bless.
God bless. All right. Well, that was Pastor Stephen Feinstein, everybody. Keep him in prayer. He's a good friend of mine. We do ministry together. He's my sending church. Again, super smart dude. Love him to death. So happy that we can be in ministry together. Keep each other in prayer. Love you guys. Have a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and we'll see you guys next time on Reformed Perspective. God bless.